Yeah, you're good. So I'll also do some shout-outs. Shout out to all of the Philippines and all of Asia. Your support means the world to me. Shout out to my teammates, my contingent mates in Ateneo, and to Tobi for tolerating me throughout this entire era. Finally, I'd like to shout out my girlfriend who knitted a scarf because she knew to be cold in Madrid and I hate the cold. So even to this stage, I carry her with me. She's the scarf is on the table right next. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. It's the third time. I am so glad I'm not OG. The first thing I'm going to do is outline a defense of status quo. We still have communities. You still see yourself as an individual related to that community, but the primary source of your identity is your ability to dictate yourself, and your primary obligations are to yourself. This doesn't mean that you never affiliate with your community, but simply it is the way that the community tries to get you to affiliate with them in the first place changes. Namely, the obligation should not be from you to the community, but that the community should convince you to stay within that community. This stems from 3 competitive reasons. The first is simply put, there's competition between communities, which means there's a strong incentive for trying to provide better and better services, or alternatively better and better narratives for you to opt into. But secondly, there's also a fear of dilution and general weakness, which means they have to create positive incentives for you to help others and create a strong community. Thirdly, and obviously, is that there's an option to disaffiliate and not go to any community at all because community is simply not good enough for you. The problem with opening government's flippant response to my POI is that these penalties, these obligations, manifest badly. They always have and they always will. Theoretically, you can opt out, but it is never a realistic choice for 3 structural reasons. 1, because everybody believes in it and therefore no one questions it. It is almost impossible to come up with the confidence to speak up in status quo. Beyond that, it's impossible or difficult to have visible and invisible examples of other people trying to speak out in the first place, and it's difficult to leave, to move to other places and to mobilize enough support to give yourself a job, to give yourself a community. If community is so important to government, you could never feasibly leave. But secondly, worst of all, is that once they are, feel the need to instrumentalize you, right? You feel like you're strung along, right? So it's constitutive of your identity, which means it's hard for you to criticize it internally because you feel it so deeply connected to yourself, and it's hard for you to criticize it to others because they feel like it's an attack on themselves. So realistically speaking, criticism is not an alternative on government bench. But thirdly and finally, that it never occurs to you that the obligation is the problem in the first place, and this blame is displaced onto other groups of people, other problems in your life, despite the fact that it has and always will be your community. Status quo is a far better site than this alternative. We move to the first argument. People live better, happier, and more fulfilled lives. All people believe they have an obligation to the community on government, but they do not necessarily fit in. We believe that over time, these communities become less and less good for you, less and less fulfilling, and make you less and less happy. First, communities tend to be imposed arbitrarily on you upon birth. Another criticism to their point of opting out is simply that they never explain how you can opt out. You might say in your head that you can opt out, but if you're that LGBT person in opening government example and you try to opt out of a sex community, of a homophobic community, how do you stop heteronormative standards being fed down to you, being forced down your throat? How do you stop your parents at dinner table saying terrible things to you over and over again? This simply isn't a realistic alternative when you don't have competitive incentives to want to improve that community over time, such as the harms never manifest in the first place. But beyond that, these communities are structurally likely to displace you because one, there are just millions of ways that will not suit you or your beliefs just by accident. And beyond that, over time, the mechanism of social change, either these communities were built and optimized for the past, but as social change and time goes on, you are simply not the person this community is built for. They are built on traditionalist, conservative beliefs that simply do not fit the worldview of today. But secondly, and worst of all, is that values and beliefs within communities become more malleable on opposition bench. The first thing is that simply put, more people question many of these things and can criticize whether or not they're good. So maybe in opening government, there are some obligations that they are good, and we can agree. But there are some obligations that are bad. Some of them are a waste of time. Some of them lead to corruption. Some of them are insufficiently accountable. And we observe that when more people question them, you are much able to improve and drastically change these structures, as the actual pooling of resources is itself good. I'd like to note that this impact has 2 immediate outcomes. The first outcome is that the actual services themselves get better, since the pooling is not done towards harming people, but actually good in the first place. So government never proves that these resources are used for something good. But secondly, and more importantly, is that if they are bad, ineffective, people never opt into these services in the first place, and you get a community that works for no one and for nothing. The second impact is that simply put, people are more receptive to criticism. The upper stage is the initial mechanism I provided in the initial part of the speech, which is that when you don't feel like it's the only part of your identity, or the main and critical part of your identity, you are more receptive to change within this community, because you don't feel like it's an assault on your identity, and you don't feel like stagnancy is necessary for stability and safety. Which means that you are substantially more likely to allow for change, whether you're a person in power or a person with the capacity to vote, with the capacity to change rules in the household, so on and so forth. But thirdly and finally, is that communities themselves have a larger felt obligation to help people for the structural reasons we provided earlier in the intro. What are the impacts of these points independent of their destruction of government states? The first is that simply put, these classes, these cultures, and so on are preconditions for many of the material needs you have to survive, in order to have food, water, and so on, to have a sense of belonging. And so when these things are from the beginning terrible, or they grow worse over time because they grow less and less into your life, or worse of all, you are unable to go to the one that actually is best for you, you live a much, much worse life, and is a precondition to any possible benefit that might arise from debate. But secondly, and worst of all, is that this worsens communities over time. If government is right that some communities are good and some are bad, more of the worst ones tend to arise, and less of the good ones tend to stay in place and stay in power. Third and finally, is that simply people are less happy. They have less time to explore their own preferences. They have less time to explore their individual ways, the obligations they might be to themselves, for the basic reason that they feel that this is mostly subsumed by the community, and hence they are less and less happy. They less know what they can do in that community in the first place. So maybe they might need some basic conditions for happiness, but they never have the sufficient conditions to know themselves and be happy in the first place. Closing.
So, how would you define your community, and do you think you only have one today?
Probably when you have the capacity to question that community, you can have people come together to decide what that community needs in the first place. When the discussion about what the obligations are in the first place, that's when you actually get the benefits. The way up of this argument is quite simple. It's important, one, because this is just a definition of access, right? If it's gated by racism, if it's gated by terrible notions within that community, even if you can pool resources, if it never gets to you, or it doesn't get to you because you don't feel like you have the opportunity to access it, or worst of all, because they don't feel like it should be given to you, then there's no guarantee that this pooling of resources has the right distribution. But secondly, and more importantly, is that this flips their main benefit. If community identity is good, it gets better. If community identity is bad, then opening opposition fix it. The second argument quickly is that this makes conflict worse and more difficult. Some of the worst conflicts in the human race are spurred on by these communities and the willingness to instrumentalize and dehumanize individuals. The problem is that, one, you drastically increase your capacity to mobilize resources, both on a human basis as well as the capacity for people to allow certain things like funding for arms and so on, as well as their capacity to dehumanize others for the basic reasons that they feel like it is their forced obligation to, but beyond that, secondly, that these resources become zero-sum between communities. It's much harder for you to see an intersectionality between communities. I lost my time, by the way. It's much harder for you to see the differences or the similarities between these communities because you are so focused on this one community subsuming your entire life. So maybe they spend more and more time in that one community, but the problem is that many communities get weaker and weaker over time as they are trodden on by the larger ones that cause hate crimes, that cause destruction, that cause war. Maybe open government is right that some communities are good, but they never allow them to be. That's why we oppose.
To thank the leader of the opposition, I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to have the floor.
In the world of opposition, community is a trap that alienates you from your very sense of self, discourages you from discovering your own preferences, and emboldens the worst forms of tyranny. The first thing I want to do is explain why individuals feel deeply alienated and unhappy in their world. Because the extent of their material is to say that you can derive happiness from helping your community. Problem, they never explain why people have the capacity to help their community. And I would suggest in any given society, very few people will have the resources to give back to their parents, especially those in the most vulnerable and marginalized situations where they need, as a precondition to be able to help, to prioritize themselves to their extent. And this is where we flip the material. The vast majority of people fail their obligations far more often than they're able to meet them, even in the smallest ways. Most people become busy with their job, can't call their grandma, can't call their parents, can't vote in an election because there are other things that preoccupy them by matter of necessity. The difference is that on that side of the house, the unhappiness and intense feeling of failure you feel
as a result of everyone saying that you have this obligation intensifies. And this is where their case falls apart, right? Because they can't assume there is a magic pill that leads you to believe in social conditioning. The mechanisms of social conditioning remain largely the same. This is things like legal punishments. It's in their world where communities become more harsh, become more dogmatic, and become more willing to impose strict punishments on people who fail to meet their obligations. So when they talk about the elderly who cannot contribute, who cannot work a job, these are the people that society comes to resent on their side. These are the people who are more unhappy. Look at how marginal the entirety of Proposition's case is, secondly, for all of the material we give you from David as to why alienation results. First, that you aren't given the time and capacity to find your preferences. Yes, you believe you have an obligation to your community. That doesn't mean your preferences are automatically aligned with what the community says your preferences should be. Individuals will still want to find and want to pursue their passions. The problem is in your world, they're constantly discouraged and are never given the avenues to explore their passions. You aren't given the things like access to education, given the things like access to extracurriculars, because in their world these are seen as distractions rather than useful things that individuals ought to pursue. Second, because even when you find your passions, you're constantly forced to make sacrifices, constantly never tolerated and never given the option to voice out your own preferences. But third, because even if you are able to engage in your passions to some extent, you feel constantly burdened because you feel like the opportunity cost of not helping your community is always what you're sacrificing. Take the example of an Asian child who thinks all constantly that he has to help his family, he has to help his parents. Even when he does find genuine joy in playing video games, every waking moment of that means of happiness is plagued by the thought that he isn't doing enough for his community, that he is failing his obligation. And this is where the analysis from David is crucial, because we explain why the expectations of communities get worse in this world, why the obligations become harder and harder to meet as a result of people not being able to opt out and communities having no competition mechanism that facilitates them. Even if you get better collective action problems, people are just unhappier, and that is worse. Secondly, let's engage with OG and explain why this narrative makes communities themselves worse. Because the entirety of OG's substantive case is that communitarianism motivates people to engage in collective action, fulfill their social obligations, and do things like vote elections. The problem with this is at no point do they explain why these are all exclusive. The first thing I'd point out is that self-interest can motivate each of these impacts as well. It is possible, in fact, to align self-interest and come to collective solutions. You want to vote for outcomes that benefit you. You love your parents as an individual, which is why you vote for them. I recognize gains for the society and economy writ large still raise your own quality of life, which is why you work towards them. And here's the kicker. It's in their world where individuals are less likely to consider what outcome is best for society because they don't view themselves as having that role or that responsibility. They believe that the community is the only actor that can dictate what's best, which is why they never seek to imagine these in the first place. You are bound to what leaders tell you is the best outcome, which is why on net you actually get worse outcomes from them. But secondly, I point out, for many of their own impacts to work, you need a level of individuality. You need to have the motivation to climb the social ladder before you can give back to your parents. You need to have the economic capacity to do things like that. Insofar as individuals are less likely to take that step, less likely to move away, less likely to pursue a job in a different city because they feel like they are failing that obligation, you don't get any of the benefits you yourself clamor for. But thirdly, I point out that solutions to collective action problems are both more likely to be sought out by the people and better done when communities actually feel like they need to benefit the individuals in question. Because government assumes that the mechanisms by which communities decide what outcomes they work towards remain the same. But that can't be the case, because many of the mechanisms we rely on in status quo, like the vote, are premised on the recognition that individuals are superior to the community. The fact that they're premised on the idea that communities don't know everything. Accountability requires a level of independent thought and requires a meaningful opt-out, which is why they cannot get their impact. I'll take closing if you have one.
Do you view debate as your community as well as the community you were born into?
Okay, so this is where I want to flip the point of intersectionality. Communities become less tolerant with people having more than one community in opposition for three reasons. First, because every obligation and your ability to feel every obligation is seen as zero-sum. You are either filling your obligation through the debate community or you are filling it through your nationality in the instances where these compete. Second, because individuals themselves are less exposed and less likely to seek out other communities in the first place. Why would my parents, in a world where they think my only role is to be a servant to my community, allow me to engage in debating, allow me to spend the holidays in Madrid rather than spend time with them? I'm sorry, Dad. But thirdly, the more forced to make trade-offs to the most immediate community, because that is the one one with the most power. I want to note here, communities themselves thriving is not an outcome that can win proposition in the debate, insofar as they don't explain why those communities are good. We explain why on net communities get far, far worse, which is why our material and our responses put us ahead. Thirdly, let's talk about conflict, because this argument is independently debate-winning and heard absolutely minimal response, which is just to say that nations have an incentive to propagate conflict and nationalism on either side. Clearly, the difference is a few things. First, it manifests in how willing people are to disengage from that conflict and disengage from the terrible things the states are willing to do to them. It manifests in how willing you are to question, how willing you are to form counter-identities and counter-communities. Say like you are revolutionary, secede from your state, declare yourself as an independent actor, rather than continue to be forced to exist in the community you were born into. But second, it manifests in how willing you are to dehumanize other people, when you see them as fundamentally different from you, because you don't consider yourself an individual, you consider yourself a part of your community. That is when you are far worse, that is where you are most alienated. For those reasons, opposed.